Chapter 10. I could hear an injured bird flapping its wings, trying in vain to fly. At midnight, the flapping shattered my dreams. Apart from the second of the flapping wings, the city was silent. I got up and looked out the window. There was something sinister in the darkness. The phone rang. I A panicky voice said, "Have you heard?" I couldn't figure out what it was and started to feel afraid. "Stupid, you haven't heard," the voice said angrily. "The country's been plunged into darkness. Everything is finished and you are still sleeping." All sleep vanished from my eyes and a chill ran down my spine. As I hung up, I heard a helicopter take off. It was the first time I had ever heard a helicopter in Kathmandu at midnight. I went and switched on the television. The phone rang again. "Disaster struck," someone said. "What's happened?" I said. "I don't understand." It was sitting. He had trouble getting through to me. The network was jammed. "Put on BBC," he said. BBC and CNN were carrying breaking news. The Indian television channels had also picked it up. I felt engulfed by a cloud. I couldn't see anything. Suddenly, I heard noise outside in the neighborhood. I ran outdoors, terrified. The king and queen had been murdered. The helicopter I had heard was carrying the prince who had survived back to Kathmandu. This much I learned from the crowd. How did the murders take place? When? How did it? Why? So many questions remained unanswered. I left the crowd and went back inside. Nepal was a top story in the international media. Nepal Telecommunication Corporation had probably never handled as many calls. The phone rang so often I stopped answering it. That morning there was not an empty spot on the street. Everyone had come out of her house. A thick fog of uncertainty hung over us all. The state-owned radio and television stations were broadcasting sorrowful duress. There was no official confirmation of the murder, let alone answers to our questions. People were grabbing photocopies of newspapers, hoping desperately to find out what had happened. There was grief and fury in their eyes. Crowds were gathering on every street corner in the city. Groups of young people were starting to chant angry slogans. A speeding Maruti van appeared on the street nearby. Someone shouted, "Smash it! Smash it!" The van turned sharply and sped away, narrowly avoiding some pedestrians. Large groups of police were out on the street but behaving as if they weren't on duty. There was nothing they could do to control the crowds. The security situation was already out of hand. When the state media finally broke its silence, the voices of the people on the street erupted in a deafening cry. The whole valley rolled on the brink of anarchy. In a crowd near the statue of the late King Mahendra, someone threw a stone at me. I left with a bleeding ear. All I had done was to ask a few ragging youngsters, "How can you be sure there was a conspiracy at the palace?" It was a stupid time to ask that question. Soon men with shaved heads were everywhere in the crowds. It was risky for men who had not shaved their heads as a symbol of mourning to walk about. Anyone could accuse them of not showing respect to the murdered king and queen. All over town, neighborhood clubs put up notice offering free saves. Men with shaved heads held motorcycle rallies to Darbar Mark. One could predict there would be trouble just by looking at their face. The leader of these rallies carried photographs of all five of the royal family members who had been murdered. Nearby, a tire had been set alight, its pungent smoke painted to the sky black. The shop was open. I leaned on a tree trying to listen to a distant radio. A curfew had been imposed. Security personnel began ordering the crowds to clear the street near Ratna Park. Riot police resorted to baton charges. The crowd dispersed, leaving sandals and shoes scattered on the street. The curfew continued for several days. Even after a landslide over, stones continued to fall. Nepal would never be the same again. Within 2 days of the mascara, a funeral procession headed for the Aryagat at Pashupatinath with the head body, with the dead body of yet another king, the only king in Nepal's history to be crowned on his deathbed. It seemed we had regressed to the Middle Ages. During this funeral procession, yet another curfew was imposed. From the army hospital in Chowni, the body was transported along the ring road on truck. Only security personnel were present. As the procession breathed Pashupatinath, a pre-monsoon rain washed the valley clean. The last rites were performed in a rush. It was a cool evening for early June, effecting a police patrol. I entered a narrow alley. Here and there, people were pelting stones at the police. Rear troops were out in force. Some people were arrested, some were beaten. The police fired over the heads of the crowd, but people still refused to clear the street. I heard the sirens of police vans, but couldn't make out which way they were heading. Ambulances roared through the streets. A brick thrown at one of the police officers hit me in the back. I crouched in the doorway of a shop with closed shutters when a policeman sped past. I pretended to be passed out drunk. Only a few hours had passed since the crowning of the new king at Basantapur Palace. The ceremony had been telecast live. Government officials and political leaders had paid their respect to the new king, placing a coin at his feet and bowing before him. Then a carriage procession carrying the king headed towards Narayan Palace. The grim expression on the king's face was mute testimony to the tragedy of the preceding Friday night. Soldiers, many on horseback, guarded the streets. I ran into Sherpa mountaineer I knew. Angfurva had just returned from an abortive expedition to Amadablam. His face was terribly sunburned. 5 foreigners, mountaineers, were with him. They were trying to find a taxi, but there were none on the streets. I had a bad dream in the first camp, Angfurva said. We abandoned the expedition after the weather got worse the next day. The foreign mountains listened intently. One of them, who had a nasty gas on his nose, pointed to his own and said, "Couldn't climb the mountain, but I'm taking this souvenir back to show my friends." Further along, I ran into the Spanish man I knew, racing madly from Tamil to Darbar. He had once come to my gallery and almost bought a painting called Winter in the Hills, but he had left without buying it, saying he would come back later. Now he was in such a panic. He looked like he was desperate for some life-saving medicine. "What's wrong?" I asked. "My plane's about to take off," he wailed. "But there aren't any taxis. I want to leave. Any place with journalists pouring into it isn't safe for tourists." He vanished down the street. His speed made me think of Spider-Man. CNN and BBC journalists had landed in droves. It was as if the country were at war. Nepal had never received so much attention in the international media. On the Varmark, I saw hordes of foreign correspondents erecting satellite sensors and positioning their cameras for live telecast. Others were dispatching news and photos from their laptops right on the street. Deadlines. The Hotel Yak and 80 was bursting at the seams with desperate journalists. All the tourists were leaving, all the journalists were coming. Were there more journalists than tourists in Kathmandu? I wasn't sure. A never-ending queue of people was offering flower and garland to the murdered king and queen. Near me, 2 elderly men broke down in tears which flowed like glaciers melting while talking about the massacre in front of a television camera. Women carrying flowers and incense looked around, grief painted on their faces. I headed home with the outline in my mind of 2 paintings called June 1st. As I neared home, I saw a man leaning against the peach tree beside my front gate. He was wearing a cap and dark glasses. Seeing me, he straightened. He was unshaven, tall and lean, with prominent cheekbones. He carried a heavy bag. His bony face looked familiar to me. Namaste, he greeted me. Then, seeing I didn't recognize him, he said, Drisya, it's me, Siddhartha. I felt like I was sliding on snow, rattled. I looked down at my shoes, unable to say a word. I just stood there while he looked at me until finally I said, Come in. Inside, he stopped by a sketch hanging on the living room wall. It was a sketch of a primary school I had attended, where the doors never closed properly, the roof leaked throughout the monsoon. The windows never stopped the winds from rushing into the classroom, and the benches were always in disarray. The school's playground was always as dirty as a desert. Dusty as a desert. It had done this case during half-term break. Just before I left my village for Kathmandu, some children had been playing Ludo near me while others played marbles. Still others were kicking balls made of bundled rags, singing. गाउँछ गीत नेपाली ज्योतिको पङ्ख उचाली. I pointed to this case. There was an explosion there recently. I said, I'm sure you heard about it on the news. A girl in grade 2 was killed. The bomb left another student with a broken leg. Siddhartha stared at this case in silence. 2 of the teachers have been killed in the last 6 years. I continued. There's only one teacher left now. And your point is? He asked. The picture speaks to me about the state of our country. How so? I said. This school had absolutely nothing. There wasn't even glass in the window, but now even this little school's been destroyed. Whenever I look at this picture, I am reminded of the way things are in our country these days. Yes, Siddhartha said at least. I'm sorry. I understand I am partly to blame, but the ultimate blame rests with the old power center. I looked at him sharply. What are you trying to say? I am underground, he said bluntly but softly. I am here to take shelter.